Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the first of these sessions and for being part of the Institute. I'm Randy Bass from Georgetown University, and I'm here with my compatriot, Tim Eatman from Rutgers Newark. I'll let him introduce himself in just a moment. But we are very excited to be hosting this session, which we very much see as a conversation and are really looking forward to making it a very mutual conversation space to explore what some of these ideas might mean in terms of our work together and your work on your campuses. So let me first just introduce myself with a couple of sentences, and then I'll turn it over to Tim to introduce himself, and then I'll ask you guys to introduce yourselves into the chat. And then we'll dive into the session. So I'm, as I say, Randy Bass, Georgetown University. I've been here a really long time, over 30 years, had a bunch of roles here, professor in the English department, founded our Center for Teaching and Learning, and had various administrative roles in the campus, now serving in a role as vice president for strategic education initiatives, which mostly means that I get to lead this curriculum incubator known as the Red House, in which we try to foster educational innovation that pushes the university a little farther and a little faster than it might go on its own. So we're very focused on educational transformation, which is one of the reasons that this session is so important to me. Let me turn over to Tim to just introduce himself to you.
Good afternoon, colleagues. It's a delight to be here. Really excited about all of the conspiring that I've been able to do with Randy over some time now, and excited about this conversation as well. Tim Eatman is my name. I'm serving as a professor of higher education at Rutgers University, Newark, and also the inaugural dean of the Honors Living Learning Community that is headquartered there. I'm an educational sociologist and have been involved in a number of associational work nationally, serve on the board of AAC&U. Randy and I work together on bringing theory to practice. I'm a co-chair of the International Association of Service Learning and Research and Service Learning and Community Engagement, and a bunch of other organizations like that are trying to do what we're talking about today. Randy, right? Is to see what we can really conceptualize and advance with respect to real transformation. So more about me as we go on, but it's a delight to be here and to feel your energy even through the Zoom.
Thank you, Tim. Let me just take a second here to share my slides. So we've titled the session Soft versus Radical Reform Toward Educational Equity, and it's this construct of soft and radical reform. We made the title with a V for versus, but I think as we go along, you'll see that Tim and I actually don't see this as a versus at all. It was really important to this conversation, we think, to create some tension and relationship between soft and radical. So that's really, sort of a founding premise here. The reason that we were really so interested in this session, if it isn't obvious, and it's certainly after the opening provocation by Femi, it may be obvious why we need to talk about this. But I think that, each in our own ways, and Tim and I have had, some intersections in our careers, but played different roles in our institutions. But both of us, I think, are really concerned with the question of what does real transformation look like? What does it mean to get beyond incremental change? I know that as somebody who's advocated for change in higher education my whole career, I'm always worried that we're, playing on the edges, that we're just doing work that can be easily absorbed, et cetera. And so I think that that's really why this question of what really constitutes transformation, what would constitute radical transformation, is one that maybe we're all invested in, and one that I think that we've been concerned about for a long time. higher education is really built to absorb a certain kind of change. I know there's a stereotype that, it's static and it hasn't changed for 1,000 years, but actually that's not true at all. It's changing all the time, but it's a certain kind of change. It's actually built to be quite flexible to absorb a very particular kind of change that is often within the tolerance of the kind of ascendant systems. And so that's one of the reasons why we think it's really important to interrogate this question of what does it mean to think about real transformation or soft versus radical reform? And then, of course, anybody who's tried to do change on their campus, you know that if anybody on your campus is invested in the status quo, then almost any significant change feels radical. So it's a very relative thing as well. So probing how can we even talk about the relationship between soft and radical that's both relative and perhaps absolute in some ways. So the other thing, I think that one of the things that Tim and I talked about, and my job here is to open us here with 10, 12 minutes or so to both give you a sense of our terminology and some of the ways Tim and I thought about this together. And then, of course, Tim will jump in and deepen this. But that we're concerned that this is Tim's wonderful term, that there's a shrinking imagination in higher education, especially at a moment when we should be opening up to alternative realities. And I think there's a lot of reasons. Some of them are political, like we just heard, but some of them are also some of the disruptions. But that this problem of shrinking of imagination is really one of the things that's at the forefront of our thoughts as we kick off this session. I think the other reason to focus on a soft radical distinction is to think about what my colleague, our colleague here at Georgetown, Olufemi Taiwo, wrote in a powerful book published a year or so ago called Elite Capture, which is that many well-meaning reforms begin with strong radical aspirations, but then are likely to be captured by certain power dynamics that neutralize some of their initial radical intentions. And so by maintaining a look at both soft and radical, it might be a way to avoid some of the downsides of elite capture, although it's pervasive in everywhere, as Fahmy says in his book. And then finally, might a greater focus on the soft radical distinction make it less likely that higher education retrenches from political critique? This is obviously a moment, and a lot of this institute is given over to some of the assaults out in the political and social and cultural environment. And there will maybe be some tendencies for us to retreat from some of the more radical visions. And I think that's also one of the reasons that we think it's important to keep this on the surface. So all of these are the things that I think motivated Tim and me to open up this conversational space. So we're going to drop these into the chat, and this is what we want to talk about later. I realize we haven't yet really described the distinctions, but thought it'd be good to kind of tee up the questions. To have you be thinking as we're presenting, is this a useful distinction to you? There's nothing sacred about these terms, but is this idea useful? What does this distinction between soft and radical look like at your institution? And how might holding space for this distinction or holding space for radical reform possibly shape how equity work might take place at your institution? So this is just a preview of the questions and to activate you to think about this as we move through some of our presentational part. And then we really would love to have a very engaging conversation with you. We have a lot of time left for that. So let me say some things about where this particular terminology comes from. And the framing and the construct I'm going to show you, even though obviously you can find echoes of these terms in other writers, comes from a writer named Vanessa Machado de Oliveira Andreotti. Under the name Machado de Oliveira, she published this very powerful book called Hospicing Modernity, which is very complex, but highly recommended. And in which she's really looking at this question of how do we move, past the sort of natural decline of modernity. In that book, one of the many things that she offers is one of the things that she calls a social map. And I'm about to bring that up on the screen here. But she thinks of this map, as she says, because people operate from different orientations to institutional spaces. And as we talk about these different notions of reform, it's also almost inevitable that different stakeholders within a single institution are all resonate to different orientations to these reforms. She also talks about the importance of holding space for the contradictions and paradoxes within and between different understandings and aspirations. And I think that's also very much where Tim and I come at from this, understanding that there's going to be soft and radical, or whatever terms you would use, notions of change that are simultaneously existing and in dialogue on your campuses. And how do you negotiate them? How do you make them visible? How do you make them powerful and energetic? I think that's really the kinds of things that we're asking here. So here's what her social map is in this particular case. So she says that there's a soft reform space, a radical reform space, and she has a beyond reform space. The soft reform space is the one that she says begins with the premise that the system is fine, it just needs to be optimized. The radical reform space says that the system is rigged, and if we want real transformation, we're going to have to change the rules. And this is what she defines as, some of the constructs of what the rules are, deep structural, systems of oppression. And when Femi in the opening plenary, comments that education can be liberatory, but education is a system of oppression. This is obviously what he was talking about. And then in the beyond reform space, she's talking about the conditions of modernity are unfixable. System contains seeds of its own failing. We have to move modernity to palliative care, which is this complex concept of hospicing she has. We think that the beyond reform space is probably too much for this session and for this moment, but we'd be happy to take on modernity in another context. So we're just going to stick with the first two and focus on soft and radical because that feels sufficiently rich. So just to say a few more words, and then I'll show you a couple slides of her text on the distinction here. She says that the difference between soft reform and radical reform is this. Soft reform tries to improve the system without explicitly questioning its assumptions. Radical reform steps back to ask basic questions about values that inform structures. Radical reform suggests that change only comes with shifts in power, hierarchy, and roles. So that's one basic definition, whether you're working within the governing assumptions or you're actually step back to questioning those assumptions, especially with regard to power, hierarchy, and roles. She also says, it makes it very clear that she is not disparaging any version of reform, including soft reform, she would call soft reform, that reduces harm or amplifies the voices of the marginalized or redistributes resources. All of that is worth doing. And I would say all of the work that's going on here at this conference is all in the frame of reducing harm, amplifying the voices of marginalized, and increasing opportunity and resources for everyone. So we are not at all implying that even if you're labeling it soft reform, that somehow it's not worth doing. That is not at all our intention. So let me just give you some of her words around soft and radical reform to just deepen the idea here. She says, for soft reform, the theory of change, since I can't see my whole screen because of your beautiful faces, I'm going to read it off my paper. The theory of change orienting soft reform is one of methodological adjustments in institutional settings. The idea is that the systems and structures we inhabit are structurally sound, but the way that we engage them requires updating our practices to ensure continuous improvements in efficiency and effectiveness. Therefore, the only possible proposition is to expand access to existing institutions. And that is clearly a huge premise of the ATI goal, and it's a huge premise of the work going on at this institute. And again, this is not to disparage that as a goal, it's just to recognize the framework by which that work goes on. Radical reform, on the other hand, she says the proposition of radical reform is that historical and systemic harms can be redressed only by radically restructuring social relations. Thus, the hope is to make more space for different knowledges, peoples, and experiences, and reallocating resources to support their presence. And that will lead to transformation of an institution system rather than absorbing them into the institution or system that would otherwise be unchanged. So one way to think of that is that it's not just methodological, but it's epistemological. It's about whose knowledge and whose resources do you value. But it's also saying that by diversifying those knowledges, you're actually changing the system. You're not merely absorbing them into the current system. So last here, proposed strategies for decolonization in this space, therefore, include empowerment, amplifying, centering the voices of marginalized subjects, that is substantive representation that goes beyond tokenism, and resource distribution. So this is just how she distinguishes soft from radical reform. Just another couple of slides and I'll turn over to Tim. So as Tim and I think about some initial thoughts on this, and this is partially as a segue to Tim, but we talked this through before. We just want to emphasize these few, broad ideas to open the space. One, we're not proposing, nor is Vanessa Andreotti, that soft and radical reform are hard categories or ontologies. It's really meant to create a space for us to think about the difference between certain kinds of change. Second, holding them together perhaps then enlarges the imaginative space of equity work, and that's the purpose of keeping them both present, not to move from one to the other or say that one's valuable and one's not. Or it enlarges how we think about the arc of our work of equity. And first and foremost, I think the one thing that we do agree on is it's important not to mistake soft for radical reform. And that's very much what the system of higher education often does, is make any change feel like it's radical, because it's always in reference to the status quo, the current distribution of power, and the structures of the past. So I am just going to bring this slide. Whoops. Oh, no, I guess I'm not. Okay, great. So those are my opening remarks. And I will now turn it over to Tim to pick up on these ideas and carry us into his perspective on some of these questions.
Thanks a lot, Randy. Maybe you can go to the next the next slide. Oh, no. First, go back. Yeah. Good. So much of what Randy and I have been thinking about, and we believe that you're interested in, is this notion of interrogating radicality. I mean, I'm curious, maybe someone in the chat could just surface in a word or two, in a phrase or two, something radical you've seen happen in the academy, a radical change of some sort, a radical program, or I don't know, maybe humor us, and just as we're talking now, begin to surface some of those things in the chat would be awesome. And as you do that, I'm mindful of the fact that I've always been kind of really cautious with the word radical, right? You think about the freedom fighters, and you think about the folks that have done this massive level change, and how can I Randy, add myself to that mix? Do you know what I mean? Like that's pretty audacious, right? To to add myself to that mix. In fact, if you go to the next slide, I was recently at the University at Ole Miss, at the University of Mississippi, and I had the chance to be in the presence of someone, Randy, that I think has some real radical credibility. Right? This is James Meredith. Some of you know that 60 years ago, he was really instrumental in the desegregation of Ole Miss. There's not only a statue out in front of one of the buildings in honor of him, but I had the pleasure of meeting this 91-year-old man, Randy, 91. Real firm grip, strong brother, and being in his presence was really powerful. The first thing he said to me was, he said, "God damn it, son, your hair is whiter than mine." I said, okay. But But, when we think about the institutions of higher education, and particularly around some of the challenging ways that we have structured ourselves that Randy has alluded to earlier, around this question of transformational change, we certainly would want to have, things like that, right? The integration of our institutions on our mind. And what does it take to do something like that, right? Randy mentioned that, these institutions have the wherewithal, the possibility of being involved in radical change, ranging from soft to hard. But what does it take to actually do that? When I think about folks like James Meredith and the work that he did 60 years ago, I think about that. But sometimes, Randy, I feel encouraged myself, right, about using the word radical with respect to some of the work that I've done, and even what my own experience is in higher education. And we talked about this, Randy. I was the fourth Black man to be tenured in the School of Education at Syracuse University in 106 years. Right. So I'm not surfacing that to suggest that I'm, any kind of a stellar scholar. I mean, I'm just an average, academic, right? I mean, but our systems are so entrenched, right, Randy, with this idea of, what it takes to move away from some of the gatekeeping that we've been involved in, some of the structures that it really does warrant us taking a hard look and having some serious conversations that hold these notions of radicality in tension. Randy, I'm going to share my screen a second so I can just share that 1.5-minute video that I mentioned, and it will give our colleagues, I think, a little bit of a light as to what some of the things that we're trying to do at Rutgers look like with respect to this kind of reform.
Rutgers is redefining the approach to honors education with an inclusive program that welcomes students from all walks of life, where age is just a number, and it doesn't matter where you are in your academic career. Whether just starting out or starting over, our students hail from 6 continents, with 50% joining from our own home community. They come together to live, learn, innovate, and strive to improve our society. These are the leaders of the future. Many of Rutgers University Honors Living Learning community students have experienced the nation's greatest challenges and inequities firsthand. Every HLLC scholar has not only achieved academic excellence, but has also demonstrated a commitment to creating a more just and equitable society. Working with an admissions panel that includes community partners, Rutgers uses a holistic, interactive vetting process to select the types of students who will shape our society for the better. As an anchor institution, Rutgers is committed to contributing to our home city through intentional programs that have a meaningful impact. Along with the required minor in social justice, the HLLC curriculum embeds hands-on coursework in our city by collaborating with community residents, stakeholders, and local business partners. Faced with real problems, students are envisioning and implementing actual solutions. By adopting this nationally recognized model for honors education, we are not only providing valuable support to our local community, but also nurturing the next generation of leaders.
Randy, maybe you can put the slides back up. I wanted to share that recently developed piece to give you just a flavor of what we're trying to do in terms of thinking in a radical way about transformation in higher education by taking the very notion of honors and interrogating it, right? I'll restate, feel free to bring the slide up, Randy, when you...
Yes, I'm attempting to do that.
Okay, yeah. It's, I think it's pretty gutsy, actually. And I'm always really cautious. Again, I said it before, and I'll say it again, when assigning radicality to myself or to anyone outside of some of the luminaries that we can think of. But as Randy has mentioned, with the model and the framework that we've aforementioned, we believe that it warrants that kind of a closer look, a kind of a introspection that we don't often do enough of in higher education. And so this example at Rutgers Newark, is again taking on honors, really trying to redefine it and help us think in a more capacious way, a more expansive way about what we need for our democracy and how honors can contribute to that, what that means for cultivating talent and what it means for our pedagogy and engaging communities. Next slide. I think that at the base of this, colleagues, radicality really operates at the intersection of 5 I's. Maybe trying to be a little cute with this or alliterative, but 5 I's: intentions, integrity, ingenuity, imagination, and impetus. I'm going to say them again, and I'm going to also put them in the chat, Randy, because maybe folks can chew on them as we go forward. There's a lot of reform that is not very positive, actually, and so I think beginning with intentions is really critical. The intention of our work at Rutgers Newark was to stop overlooking local talent. Like, we could begin there, right? We've seen in the last 10 years, Randy, an 80% increase of students from Newark, from the hood, in many cases, not all, who are enrolled at the university, right? Is that a radical change? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It certainly is a message that the belonging factor is shifting. And we think that in order for the kind of deeper change that you and I have been talking about, we need to do that, right? What are intentions? How is it buttressed with integrity and ingenuity, right? Imagination and impetus. I'm going to just fly through these last couple slides so we can get on to the other part of the conversation. But in order to do that imagining, we've had to think deeply about an admissions process. We have a 2-phase admissions process. We bring about 150 or so students together 4 or 5 times a year, and we engage them with community members and faculty and people from the dining services at our campus to select this cohort of 80 scholars who are going to be in the honors living learning community. And their scholarship award is room and board, and their responsibility is a 18 credit curriculum. Next slide. The curriculum really is, we think, where we can do the kind of heavy lifting that we need to do to press them to think about their own radicality within their chosen discipline, but adding this social justice focused minor to the work. Next slide. We have done this and at the same time created a brand new building project, which is a state-of-the-art building. It's an $80 million project where we can sleep up to 351 students. And Randy, I'm going to end with this. The special sauce, I think, of the program really is around the fact that within the 80 member cohort, 50 of the students are from high school, 17, 18-year-olds, and 30 of them, about a third, are holders of community college associate's degrees, right? And so pushing the idea of what intergenerational sort of engagement can look like. We've got 60-year-olds and 17-year-olds living and learning together. We're not afraid of parents, people returning as parents to do their degrees, or veterans, or people who have aged out of the foster care system or who have overcome the school to prison pipeline. But really the HLLC begins with, we think, a innovative, radical questioning of what block scheduling at the university could look like if it incorporated some of the high impact practices, including, and not the least of which, is residential living learning communities. So Randy, I'm going to just stop there, and hopefully that gets us to a next level of engagement where we can hear from our colleagues about what their thinking is regarding some of this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. You said so many rich things there, and we'd love to spur people to, again, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand. We'd really love to move into a conversation here about your, whatever language you want to use. I think we're interested in whether, you're resonating to or uncomfortable with the idea of soft and radical reform. It's not like we have any stake in that language, but whether that kind of a distinction or aspiration resonates with you. But let's just use the word radical here as something that really shifts something in your institution. We'd love to have you either share in the chat or raise your hand. It seems like, just to while you folks are thinking about that, to call out a couple of things that you said, Tim, that seems so powerful, that to me feels like at least it has radical potential. And maybe that's also a word to introduce here, that nothing is ever in itself radical. It's how it develops and how it emerges. Femi said in his opening provocation that equitable admissions is a discipline, not a passion. And the fact that the reimagined honors community begins with this whole new discipline of admissions that's not just a closed process, but engages the community, feels like the first of several, kind of sacred things that you've taken on. The fact that you took it on with honors, which honors in many institutions, especially selective institutions, excellence has for so long been equated with exclusion, right? And you took an entirely different approach to what honors meant, that it wasn't about exclusion or about past accomplishments.
But Randy, I mean, that in and of itself, I think, is really an important place to be, right? Because we are so good in the academy at putting into view and into practice and into process, right? Certain kinds of things that we don't necessarily have a hearty rationale for, right? But we keep. I mean, I mentioned my own tenure experience, right? That's ridiculous. The probability that there would only be one, and more in 106 years is ridiculous. Like, that doesn't even match up with the way we do research, right? But so this is one of the reasons why I think taking on honors for us at least was important. And I'm curious, nobody took me up on the invitation to put anything in the chat, but that's all right. Maybe my digital breath stinks or something. I don't know. I really would love to invite folks to how do you feel about the word radical? Have you been exposed to any things that you would consider either soft, along that continuum? What is your sense about, where higher education has traditionally been in taking on some of these, hard, fast, and traditionally grounded notions that we advance? I didn't mean to interrupt you, Randy, but it just struck me that, I wanted to dig down on this notion of how we make it a practice of kind of reifying the status quo.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, let's create some. I have a long list of things I appreciate about your work, but let's create some space for people to step in and really encourage if people are willing to contribute to the conversation, because we really like to make it a conversation. Just leave some space. And again, if you want to drop something in the chat, if you want to raise your hand. What's an example of equity work on your campus where you feel that you're not just implementing greater inclusion or expansion of current structures, but where you're really challenging some fundamental idea, some fundamental structures of resources, assumptions?
And we're inviting hands too, right? People to actually speak out if they wish.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Love to hear from some of you colleagues. Here's one, University of Iowa.
Get us going.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Vanessa Andreotti, and I am from University of Iowa. I have a very general question about radical versus soft kind of change. And my question is that to what extent should a radical change really be inspired very systemically and deductively, so that the other kind of, if we think about that from an ecosystemic perspective, to what extent should it come from an institutional perspective so that the other units and the kind of different parts of an institution can make changes? Or can it start from a specific part of the institution and it can then disseminate itself and also become a cultural change there? According to the book that you introduced, or kind of some of the kind of literature here, and also Tim's wonderful experience, what would be some practical perspectives in this regard?
Thanks so much for the question. I don't know if Tim, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, go right
first.
ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead.
So, I mean, I think you raise a number of questions that I think are really worth interrogating. I think that, you know, my perspective on it, say from the perspective of the work that I've tried to do over the years, in which, you know, especially the transformational work we've been trying to do out of the Red House over the years, is that it's very difficult to take on something radical at a very large scale or at a system-wide scale unless there's, you know, huge institutional force behind it, which is often some kind of crisis. So that things can start small and localized. But one of the phrases that we've often used is the idea of small game-changing innovations, so that there can be something that about it that is fundamentally, as we would say, breaking at least one rule or fundamentally redefining something that is itself had been something sort of sacred or an assumption or an untested assumption, as Tim was saying about honors. So I don't think an innovation has to start big, but it needs to start with some kind of even latent radicality that's at its root. But it may not look radical at first. It may be just a small building block that creates that seed. I think we've also found that, you know, it takes a while for certain ideas that really go against the grain to socialize themselves to campuses. So sometimes if you start small, you know, within 2-3 years, it becomes assumed that, you know, that is something we just do. So it can be less threatening to introduce at a smaller scale, but it can have systemic implications if it were to scale or be more widely accepted. So I would say that is one response. It is a really excellent question.
Really great question. Yeah, I don't have much to add to that at all, Randy. I think you nailed it. I'm just mindful of the change that we've seen under the leadership of our current chancellor, which she will tell you didn't start with her. It started with a cognizance of the faculty about the gems of students that they had all around them right in the city of Newark, right? So she comes into a place that had been, you know, sensitive to, you know, that brilliance and the need for the university to step up to its possibilities. So they're just agreeing 100%, Randy, with your framing. I'm seeing another hand here from Hope College.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Casey Stevens from Hope College with my colleagues in the classroom. So we have a program at Hope, really a vision that we've started in the last couple of years called Hope Forward, that is a vision and a mission to make tuition at Hope tuition free based in generosity, kind of a pay it forward model. Really rethinking the business model of higher ed and how students' tuition is funded. And so we've had some initial generosity through that's allowed us to start some pilot programming. And one of, I think, the things that I am, I'm really proud of this program at our college, but I also realize that it's deeply dependent upon not only generosity of future alum, but also generosity of current donors and present donors to build. And I'm wondering I'm seeing some possible conflict between between radicality and the where they meet there in the middle of the pie, and just kind of wondering what maybe observations you have for, when, if I'm saying the word correctly, effrontery and integrity perhaps have some conflict, right? We want to be radical. We want to do something that's different. And we want to do it with integrity, but it also relies on perhaps folks who share a different vision than us. So maybe just to say it candidly, if we were to rely on the generosity of a donor who fundamentally disagrees with
Right.
Equity,
Right.
how do we navigate that conflict as an institution and as folks who help run the student-facing component of that program?
Yeah. Wow. First of all, I want to just say that the model working anything on tuition is, in this current age, Randy, right, is just so necessary because the value proposition of our institutions is just in wider question than I think a lot of us recognize. And so my respect to you on that. You raise a tough issue. I mean, boss, I got to raise a lot of money. You know what I mean? and a lot of the money that it could be available. It's a challenge to where we stand in terms of our intentions and our integrity. And I think it's a tough call. I really don't have, Randy, I don't know if you do. I don't have any really easy answers with that. But I do think that when we think in terms of the long game, right, it is really to our advantage to make sure that our efforts align, with our intentions and our integrity and our sense of strategy, which may mean that we miss something now, but we established a kind of disposition, intellectual disposition and posture that gives a kind of respect, that will have some sort of currency going forward. I really don't have a better. I mean, I need help with this in myself. I mean, I think it's a really important question to raise. Last thing I'll just say is that it's one of the reasons why, and Randy and I have talked about this, we think it's so important to look at community organizers and the way they operate, right? And, the sophisticated way that real community organizers, deal with strategy sheets and concept mapping and, one-to-one meetings, determining who their allies are and who their, detractors are. And those kinds of things give us the kind of information that we can bring to bear to support our values and intentions, and also to make the case for when we're going to not move in a direction. I don't know if any of that's helpful, but those are some thoughts I have, Randy.
I think that, I think first of all, I agree. I think the word radical, has a very different connotation depending on whether you're using it as a noun or or whether you're using it as an adjective, and then it has very different connotations what it is as an adjective, what it's modifying. For example, I can imagine my donors would be very excited at a phrase like radical interdisciplinarity, as thinking that's what the world needs to solve the most complex problems. Radical social change may or may not be appealing. So I think that it's a word you have to use carefully. I think that one of the things that also very much motivates us in thinking about these issues, and very interested in how people feel, is that my sense is that most donors, most supporters, many alumni are very aware that this is a moment that requires significant responsiveness from higher education to a really rapidly changing world, and that most people with resources that can help universities and believe in higher education wish higher education could change faster, could change as rapidly as society is changing, and could be more responsive to what's happening out in the environment. So I think one of the keys to thinking about a radical change strategy is to think about what's the language that engages a sense of rapidly changing environment. Is it the need for a new business model? That would excite a lot of people. Is it the need to make college more relevant as as Tim was saying, is it about democracy? Is it about keeping up with changes of technology and AI or climate in some cases? So I think that rooting what you internally think of as radical reform to what you can externally talk about as the better alignment between higher education and a rapidly changing environment that most supporters, but also critics of higher education, think that we're out of sync with. So it's that alignment between radical intentions and rapid change that I think is one way to find the language that engages to philanthropic support.
That's awesome. Really powerful response. Randy, we got a comment here from colleagues at University of Pittsburgh who are talking about the ownership of programs and initiatives as radical for some spaces in their campuses because of historically ownership of program initiatives where units really find their inherent value and pride. I think that notion of ownership is a good example of, I mean, shifting that can be make spaces feel really vulnerable, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and I'm wondering if I don't want to put you on the spot, or if it's awkward because you're in a group room. If anyone wants to elaborate on the question of ownership from Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I
Or
can do
other
that.
people?
My name is Jen Marco, and I'm from the University of Pittsburgh. And so, where we're challenged is because, as our campus has evolved over time, so, in the 1980s, we really inherited or actually, had a chancellor who really put us on the map in a whole lot of ways. And so, because of that, our footprint grew massively between then and, just about 10 years ago when he had a successor. And so really with that incredibly rapid growth, of course, we had more and more things popping up on campus that people were really proud of to put in front of students. And now that we, kind of feel in terms of programming, we are so big, our students are incredibly overwhelmed and stressed by what we offer. And they're not really sure, even if they do know the rules of engagement to college, and even if they do know kind of where to go and who to ask, they're confused. And so when we think about students who are in different populations, who are first generation, who, have different levels of access to understanding college, then those who are already having a hard time, and we are really disservicing them. And so when we think about ownership of things, I happen to be within the office of the provost. And so because we are in a central space to influence change, a lot of what we are doing is trying to teach people the value of working together across different spaces, and that, if you're doing something that is similar to someone in another space, that is not a bad thing. And we are able to work together. But that really is challenging because the last 30, 35 years, everyone was finding their value in having their own space and being called upon to really, advocate for themselves. And now we have some central structures where we're able to bring people together, but that's a total mind shift from where we've been the last 30, 40 years.
Wow. Jen, I'm so glad you elaborated on that. So really, really quite critical. Some colleagues of mine and I have been thinking about one such specific issue, and that's the relationship between diversity, access, and inclusion, community engagement, and student success. And the fact that those things tend to travel in these parallel tracks on campus in a number of myriad of programs, right? When the resonance is so much, is so critical. And, when you start thinking, more strategically about how to amplify and align those efforts, folks get threatened, right? Because, well, I own this and I own that. And it's really not about trying to take away anyone's agency or opportunity, but to return to the community organizers, to be more strategic about our aims and objectives. So we've developed a framework called full participation. I won't unpack it now, but maybe it'd be useful for you to take a look at.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Jen. Yeah, that question of ownership, and I think from an institutional level to say, well, are there structural incentives, funding incentives that then favor working across boundaries that can move toward that structural
Yeah.
change? Some cases, some institutions just physically start to reorganize.
Right.
Georgia State, one of the most famous, where they just moved a lot of different services under different units so that they would become more integrated. And that question of what does it take to create structural change across boundaries, I think is one of those radical things. Looking at a couple other things in the chat. I don't know if Alexa, if you want to share what you did in the chat, again, you're very happy to, you just want to share what you put there, but we'd love to hear more about that.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Thank you. I'm happy to share. So I started in my position about 6 years ago. And when I came to my institution, what I found was that the students who had been in the program that I was hired to coordinate had sometimes in some spaces been deemed maybe less than, right? They weren't prepared for college. They weren't going to be successful in college. And so there was kind of this negative assumptions that folks would draw about the kinds of students that would be a part of this program. And through a couple of ways, I feel like I've been able to shift that idea and that narrative around the students who are in the program. So the students that I typically serve are first generation, are low income, are coming from ethnically minoritized backgrounds. I also support students from the foster care system as well. So I know, Tim, you said that that's part of, I mean, you've got a lot of groups of demographics that you're serving. And so it's really important for me to build up those connections across campus and find opportunities for our campus to see the success of the students. And so my first year here, I started a recognition banquet in the spring semester where students could nominate and recognize folks who supported them. And I would invite those folks, students, faculty, staff, to come to this banquet and see these students get awards for achieving Dean's List, for earning a scholarship, for securing an internship or something like that, right? I was able slowly but surely to show folks on the campus, like, my students are great. Then our students in my program have been resident assistants and SGA presidents and student government association vice presidents and have done really, really amazing things. And it's just something that, to me, I was trying to decide, does it feel soft? Does it feel radical? And I don't know, but it feels important. So I felt like it was relevant and I wanted to share. So I thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, is just, you know, one of the things I think that we wanted to pose is, in what ways is the how as much potentially as radical as the what? And in your case, it's, you know, kind of a radical visibility, kind of a pride around achievements. In other cases, the most radical thing might be listening to stakeholders that don't normally get listened to. I mean, but I think that this notion that the how that we go about things can also, you know, create a more radical presence around what might otherwise feel like softer reforms. But it sounds like what you're doing is very radical. So thank you.
And Randy, I just want to dovetail on you because you know, our colleague Dr. Hodge, you know, reflects back to another commenter who mentioned something about cultural change, right? And you know, like what that takes, right? And you know, I'm really motivated, probably a lot, Randy, by my work with David Scobie and others in Imagining America, of thinking about the importance, you know, of the humanities and the arts, right, and of the kinds of practices that you know, lend themselves to, as you said, Alexa, letting people see things and feel things, right? And is that soft or is it radical? I don't know, right? But I do know that it becomes then a mechanism for, you know, helping people to get just out of our heads like we academics do, right? And to experience, you know, the kind of generation of impetus that sometimes we are able to skirt around because we're just looking at it in such an accounting-like fashion. I think I started to ramble, Randy. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, not at all. Yeah, yes, I think that's exactly right. I think if we're talking about that, part of what it means to the difference between radical and soft is that soft operates within business as usual.
Right.
Radical tries to change what business as usual is. Soft is within a dominant paradigm. Radical is trying to move toward a different paradigm, not necessarily instantly, but move toward a different paradigm. So I think just thinking about what are all the things on our campuses around equity work that is chipping away, declining part of what that dominant paradigm is. And some of it might be just celebratory community rituals, visibility. I think not to discount those kinds of things at all, but in fact, to maybe see that those are really essential to changing the culture over time. Before we move to the last couple constructs that we wanted to share, I just wanted to ask if Michelle had anything that she wanted to share here. Call you into the conversation for your nice.
Yes, thank you. Yep, Michelle Deegan at Muhlenberg College. I guess in listening to your conversations following what I put in the chat, I'm just wondering, this work takes a long time. You can't just move to radical. And, on our campus, we have been working at this for well over a decade. And we have done some things that might, in retrospect, be radical efforts to move forward in a positive way, but we're exhausted, right? So I'm wondering from you, how do you keep the energy going? We do have these celebrations on our campus, but in light of resource constraints and a very flat administrative structure, it's just, what's some words of advice to keep us heading in the right direction, knowing that we just keep making small step after small step, and we don't ever seem to get to the truly radical place that we want to be.
Whew. Yeah, man, that's good. I'm gonna take us back to James Meredith, right? This brother, can you imagine him stepping out, right, to do that work at Ole Miss at that time, 60 years ago, right? You talk about how long it takes, Dr. Deegan, to make these changes, and they haven't arrived, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's still a lot. I have to tell you, I get my gas from the students. Randy, I think we are similar in this regard. I get my gas from the students. My undocumented students have the highest GPAs.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine how you feel if you went home and you didn't know if your mother was going to be there?
Yeah.
And yet do you follow what I'm saying? And so, yeah, I get tired and exhausted, but when I see that resilience in those young people and I see them, taking us seriously, that's why, Randy, one of the most radical things I think I do is make time, real time for students. And people will do things in different ways, but that to me is the kind of thing that is an example of one of those so-called soft things, maybe, Randy, that, I know a lot of us do in a lot of different ways that can help to shifting that mindset and the culture that, Dr. Deacon addresses. Great question, though. I really appreciate it. We're still working on it.
Let me just share a screen for just a slide, maybe two, because it was a perfect segue. Thank you for that, for being clairvoyant, Michelle. One construct to just throw up here, and this particular language is my language from something I published a year or two ago from an article called "A Wicked Problems Mindset for Higher Education," but I think it's very implicit in all of Tim and my conversations, so I'll claim it as ours, even though the phraseology is mine. And it gets to this question about how much of it is about the what versus the how and the who. And I think that the radicality is ultimately in the intersection of those three things. But to suggest that maybe there's three ways to think that that this kind of radical reform lens is working. One is to be taking a critical view, and that's to be questioning fundamental assumptions. So there's a lot of different ways to do that, but to be asking, why do we do it this way, or whose interests are being served, or what is it that we're sustaining by doing it a certain way. But universities are obviously beautifully critical institutions, usually the least well against about their own practices. And so just turning that critical eye and creating institutional spaces for having those kinds of conversations, and not just among the choir, as Femi said, but really trying to have them with people who are in spaces that don't normally have them. So that's the critical view. The second is the wide view, which is including as many voices and sources of knowledge as possible. And that in many ways, although we value different kinds of knowledge, they tend to be all of a very certain type. I mean, to me, again, was so powerful about what you did with your admissions process in the Honors LLC is that you opened it up to people who never get to have a voice in that process. We're trying to do a lot of work at Georgetown around well-being, and part of that is really trying to engage staff in that conversation, not just faculty and students. It turns out that staff are the ones who are hurting the most, especially frontline staff who work with equity populations. And so a lot of what people are feeling is one of the things we need forward is not just to engage staff, but to engage staff with faculty and students together. But this notion, but that doesn't even get to the community, broader community. So a wide view is just what I think of as kind of radically expanding the voices and the sources of knowledge. That doesn't have to be perceived as radical change. It's just radical diversity of voices. But then the third thing, which I think goes to your point also, Michelle, that I think is so important. And if nothing else, I guess this is one of my last things I'd want to just share is this idea of the long view. And Tim and I talked about this, that institutions are built to resist radicality in the short run. They're just built that way. But part of it is that reform within higher education very seldom is focused on what an emerging different paradigm would look like. We often are focused on remediating the present. I'll just leave it there, remediating the present. And that could be how we think about changing the curriculum or how we think about equity work. I think what's important is to at least set out, however you do that, among whichever stakeholders, however it connects to strategy, whatever kinds of community, to name and make visible what a future-focused aspirational vision would look like, of what you think it would look like to have an equitable university.
That's good, Randy.
What would it look like to be a well-being university, as we're trying to ask? What would that look like if we were successful? Because then, no matter how small or incremental, or how resource constrained your reforms are, you can always be looking at them in relationship to this future vision. If they're only looked at in terms of the present, then they will all seem like they're successful or meaningful. But if you look at them in the future, and then you ask, and I think as you said in the chat, how would you prioritize a smaller, more resource constrained investment? It's which one can you say is getting us toward that future? So that's why the critical view, wide view, and long view, and in some ways, maybe the long view is the most important, because that's the thing that can help keep your North Star and making strategic choices about what's more transformational. I'll unshare here.
Hey, Randy, I want to connect what you just said to the question from our colleagues at Harrisburg about what steps to follow to engage in radical reform without being perceived as too radical. I think what you shared, those three views, is really a really nice strategic framework to raise that question, and then to be really specific, colleagues at Harrisburg. I think the university is also quite sensitive to peer pressure among institutions. I know that may sound sophomoric, but I found it really powerful to look deeply at what some of our peer institutions and our aspirational peers are doing with respect to the particular change that you're working on. And either bringing to bear the kind of pressure that happens from those peer comparisons, or establishing oneself as a leader, showing the opportunity to establish oneself as a leader in that regard. are some of the kinds of steps, Randy, that I think are useful in managing the gravity of being perceived as too radical. I hope that's helpful, colleagues.
Yeah. Definitely. Let me just throw up one more a brief construct. This is our last slide, I promise. And I think it builds on what Tim was also just saying, which is to say, whatever your values are, whatever it is you're trying to change, whether it's more holistic, more inclusive, more equitable, more sense of belonging, et cetera. I think that one of the ways to also think about what is radical versus soft is to be able to point to at least these four things. Maybe there's other things that you would also point to, but where have outcomes dramatically changed? Who's working at scale? Where have structures shifted? Where have resources shifted? And where has power relationships shifted, which I think goes back to ownership. But I think that these are some of the kind of invisible architecture, so to speak, of what it means to have a forward-looking view, to take a long view, is to say, and if you look at what it would look like to get to your forward-looking aspiration, it almost always would entail these things: a dramatic shift in outcomes, a significant working at scale, significant shift in structures, resources, and power. And so I think that it also, you can read from the future backward to ask these questions of the environment, and how you're changing the environment. These things will change the culture. It's very difficult to change the culture first. I think these are the things that ultimately change culture. We have a few more minutes. Are there any last comments that anyone would like to share or say? Or Tim, if you have last things that you'd like to share?
Yeah, Randy, just an appreciation for you inviting me to think with you about this. And as we said, I think this is the genesis of something larger that we can cook up. I'm really wanting to just rename just the respect for the notion of radicality, right? And not wanting to be loose with that, right? You know what I mean? Like, to treat it in the way that it deserves to be treated. And I think part of that, Randy, is honoring this range, this continuum that we've tried to surface. And I just hope that this has been helpful for some of our colleagues, and you're thinking about the work. Maybe these five intersections, will be useful for you to recall: intentions, integrity, ingenuity, imagination, and impetus. These are some of the kinds of things that I try to put on the table when I'm thinking about how to manage, engage so-called radical efforts that I'm undertaking.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Thank you for being partner on this, and thank you all for stepping into this space. I think that the core idea behind all of this is that this is a moment of tremendous volatility and a tremendous shift and change. And so if we think of ourselves as being painted into a corner and doing the best we can, we're not going to be able to take advantage of this moment. It really has to be a place where we are stepping up and saying that we can imagine alternative realities, and that from this perspective, we can exert some influence over how they shape. So thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. We hope that
Appreciate it.
enjoy the rest of the Institute. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.